Welcome back to Pro Wrestling Throwdown for the week of January 23rd, 2021. I'm Caleb Black. This is Luke the Big Dog Williams, our in-studio producer, the Mighty Max Fury. And it's time for a Superstar Spotlight, but this one's going to be a little bit different. The Undertaker was recently on the Joe Rogan Experience and had a lot to say about a lot of different subjects. Steroids, drug use, CM Punk in the UFC, and of course, what the Undertaker thinks of the current wrestling product. And there were some controversial points that he made on all of those fronts, not just specifically about the locker room and some reactions that other wrestlers had.
Right.
And we thought because it's such an interesting thing with The Undertaker coming forward and being out of gimmick and taking those interview opportunities that he always said no to, for us to talk about it, for us to get into some of those things where we can kind of, use those talking points to create a dialogue
right.
about a wrestler's opinion who's been in the business for the better part of, the last 35 years?
Easily.
30 plus years at least. Yeah. So let's get into it. One of the first things we talked about was the fact that The Undertaker is now officially on a Legends contract.
Yes.
He's no longer a full-time in-ring contracted talent, which means that, yes, Vince could still use him to pull certain things like a WrestleMania appearances or maybe even matches, and he's still getting paid. Actually, I think he's locked down for the next 20 years with the deal that he made.
Yes, yeah.
So he's getting paid regardless, but he is in a Legends contract, which makes a very interesting... They could use him for different things. We've talked about before how obviously we think he'd make a great addition and coach at NXT.
Well, yeah, not a better big man you could learn from than The Undertaker, especially for a young up-and-coming talent.
Yeah.
Height, weight of Taker would benefit greatly from learning under that tree, especially.
Yeah. The Undertaker goes on to talk about drug use and steroid use and how the WWE would combat it, and basically said, the company didn't want wrestlers getting caught, pulled over, getting popped for steroids in the public, getting popped for drugs, so there'd be a fine here. Next time you got popped, there'd be another fine. Next time you got popped, you might have a forced rehab stint. And it's an interesting thing, too, because he says, to quote him, there was a time where everybody had to be big, had to be jacked, especially the 6'8" big guys. There was the stigma that you got to be 300 pounds. It's in our head. Nobody gives a shit what they're interested in the characters and what you do on TV, but in our heads, fuck. I got to be 330 pounds. I got to be 330 pounds. There's some big motherfuckers out there, and cut. I don't know how they did it. I couldn't get away when I was on steroids. Also goes on to talk about how the fact that they traveled, back in the original days, they didn't have doctors.
No.
They didn't have trainers. They didn't have this big crew and all these protocols. And part of the evolution of the WWE's business was now they don't just allocate for travel for the wrestlers. They travel with a caravan of medical professionals, people who are there to make sure you're not injured.
Right.
Really kind of talks about how hard it was for coming up in the early 80s, later to mid 90s when guys were, just hitting it hard every single night.
Yeah, for sure.
Talks about his brother and how his brother paid for him to go to wrestling school by taking out a loan, which, is kind of really cool thinking about his brother believed in him enough to follow that passion.
Yeah.
That he put his own credit,
his own money,
his own fiscal responsibility on the line. And of course, fuck it, paid off.
Yeah, it for sure paid off. Well, I mean, you make an investment in somebody that, like The Undertaker, who's had such longevity in the business that you knew that it had to have been seen beforehand. Like, it had to have been one of those things that's like, I will hitch the wagon to you, and then, in return, I got your start. You know what I mean? I mean, and between brothers, that's pretty cool. Yeah. It's pretty epic.
Goes on to say that he got his big break due to looking like one of the Von Erichs. The Von Erichs, of course, famously ran the Dallas and major Texas territories, and talked about there was a referee who picked up on him when he was training named Bronco Lubick, who basically said, "Oh man, you look like one of the Von Erichs. We could do something with that."
Right.
And just think, again, the Undertaker gets saddled with a couple of gimmicks before he makes it to the WWE.
Big Red.
Mark, Big Red.
Yeah.
And then makes it to the WWE, has the greatest...
I'm sorry, Texas Red.
The most protected wrestling gimmick in history.
Of all time.
And now it's kind of funny thinking about that, too, because I never once even thought about the fact that he looked like a Von Erich brother. Of course, he didn't as The Undertaker.
No.
You looked like The Undertaker.
Yeah. Mean Mark, I could see it a little bit.
Yeah.
But, Big Texan, it makes sense.
Yeah. Taker would go on to remark also that when asked about wrestlers who have avoided major injuries or guys who managed to take care of themselves, he says Chris Jericho's at the top of the list.
For sure.
Chris Jericho's a guy who's never had a real major injury that had to be surgically corrected, which required a ton of time off and rehab. That's coming from Taker with 2 artificial hips and a new knee. And
Miz also would have to be at the top of that list.
yeah, Miz really doesn't get a lot of injuries either. No. But it is interesting to note that, Jericho's still active today in his 50s.
Yeah.
And still has managed to bridge that gap that, hasn't gotten hurt.
Well, yeah. Well, Jericho's always been really safe.
Yeah.
It doesn't take any more risks than needed.
Right. It goes on to talk about how the bike that they used for the Boneyard was custom made, which, as everyone who knows anything, The Undertaker is an avid appreciator.
Did they mention the Metallica angle? That Metallica was supposed to had come on board to play The Undertaker to the ring.
Yeah.
And then when COVID hit, they allowed them to use the song For Whom the Bell Tolls as The Undertaker's riding away off into the sunset.
Which is just cool. I don't care who you are. That's
Metallica
cool.
doesn't give their music to movie soundtracks, let alone, just some Tom, Dick, and Harry used the music. That's the Taker.
Right. The Undertaker's also an avid outdoorsman. He talked about his interest, now that he's not a full-time wrestling superstar, to really kind of explore that option, that he's mulling around the idea of maybe even doing an outdoorsman TV show. Along with
Michaels did it.
Stone Cold show, Shawn Michaels' hunting show. I'd be down to watch The Undertaker.
Actually, I believe he's on an episode of Michaels' show already.
Oh, Taker?
He used to be on the Outdoor Channel.
I might have to check that out.
I'm almost certain. I know Stone Cold was. I'm pretty sure Taker was too.
I'd like to see Undertaker on Stone Cold's new show.
Yeah, for sure.
Now we're going to get into one of the big controversial points and kind of what brought on the discussion of us highlighting this interview. When The Undertaker talks about the wrestling environment and how it's changed. So I'm going to read this transcript verbatim so we can properly quote it, and then he and I are going to kind of dissect it and hopefully kind of dispel some of the negativity around it and highlight some of the points that are negative. Because there is some... let me read it, and then we'll get into the discussion. In that era of guys, too, those were men. You go into a dressing room nowadays, and it's a lot different. I remember walking into my first real dressing room, and all I saw were some crusty fucking men. Half of them had guns and knives in their bags. Shit got handled back then. Now you walk in, there's guys playing video games and fucking making sure they look pretty. It's evolution, I guess. I don't know what it is. But I just like those eras, man. I like when men were men. All right. Now, a lot of words like this get tossed around, toxic masculinity, and things of that nature. And we're going to highlight some of those points. That era of pro wrestling was negative in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Rampant steroid use, as we've already highlighted. Rampant drug use. The environment existing in that way was ultimately what cost the lives of guys like Bruiser Brody, Brian Pillman,
Eddie Guerrero,
and Eddie Guerrero, only because of the accessibility of the drugs and because of, that's what it was. That also, on the other side, was what allocated for the larger-than-life personalities that wrestling created, using the idea that turning a wrestling gimmick was really you turned up to 10, and the secrecy behind the wrestling business. The men were men things, as he stated before, when he walked into a locker room, it was a bunch of big dudes, and pretty much every guy in the wrestling territories would tell you, wrestlers back then were animals. There was a lot of flagrancy. There was a lot of lechery. There was a lot of, again, drug use and chaotic elements. But the Undertakers also used that experience to highlight to younger talent that it's better to save your money.
Sure.
And stay away from the garbage.
Yeah, well, the locker room then and the locker room now is two completely different things.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Today, there isn't as many big guys in professional wrestling. It's not considered a big man's sport anymore.
No.
Or a big man's game. Drugs and alcohol have pretty much been non-existent.
Yeah.
In the back where video games and stuff have taken place. But and he's not necessarily dogging that. He's talking about how it was when he started the business against how it is now. And
again, bridging a 35-year career, it's almost reminiscent, and he does miss when wrestling was hard-hitting.
Right.
And had that gritty, kind of grungy feel to it, which is interesting considering for the better part of all of his life, he was in the entertainment company, even
Right.
by the territory standards. The WWF was always the entertainment version of wrestling. It wasn't the gritty Mid-South territories.
Right.
It wasn't the riotous Dallas territories or the Philadelphia territory. It was the entertainment company.
Well, and the thing with the video games and stuff he was talking about, a lot of extra money and promotion and stuff or video games are a way that wrestlers nowadays relax. They don't go drinking. They don't do drugs. They jump on a PlayStation or an Xbox.
Which
they
is
make they make an extra amount of money
they make
promoting these games. Xavier Woods being one of them. They've built an empire of not doing nefarious stuff backstage and still being able to perform at a higher quality, at a higher level than most people who back in the 80s, is they had to get their shit in.
Yeah.
They had to do this, they had to do that. Nowadays it's more of a brotherhood.
Yeah.
It's more of a, I'll elevate you.
Right.
You elevate me.
And in the same token, too, not saying that the territory days weren't a brotherhood either. And in fact, in some ways, we're more protected and closer, but it's different.
Yeah.
And that's the point he was making. It's changed. And again, he's coming from the guy who was there traditionally. So you got to give the man some credit. And you have to understand that he comes from the era that wrestling was for freaks and fucking outcasts. It wasn't just for the athletes.
Right.
And nominally, back then, drugs and steroids have always been an issue. They're still going to be an issue. And he's not advocating for wrestlers to go out and spend their pay on cocaine and hookers.
Right.
He's just saying he missed the day when shit was real, where it was hard-hitting. And even goes
just weed and cheap dates.
Right. And even later went on to illuminate the fact that wrestling product today is soft by a lot of standards.
He's not wrong.
It is. Some guys want to do the comedy shit. Some guys like to do the hardcore fighting stuff. And Taker has lived in both eras and has a preference, as we all do as wrestling fans.
Well, and as a legitimate tough guy and as a legitimate big guy in professional wrestling, that's not his bag.
No.
But, we argue over certain things all the time.
Yeah, I'll be the first one to admit I'm a dinosaur by a lot of standards in wrestling.
And the sad part about that is that I'm a fan of most of the stuff dated nowadays, and I'm older than you.
Yeah.
Which that just goes to show, we look at the wrestling business as a whole in a different way.
I look at it the right way. He looks at it the dumb way.
Yeah, because Otis. Anyway, but no, and we can do that because everyone's opinion is valid.
Yeah.
What works for some doesn't work for others.
Right.
It's the same thing in any
might
facet.
Be right for you. The world don't move to the beat of just one drum.
Right.
What might be right for you may not be right for some.
But we don't own those.
Please don't sue me, Gary.
We don't own those. But no, it just goes to show you it's a preference. Just like we were trying to come up with an idea for one of the videos for today's show where we were going to go over the greatest match of all time. But
it's subjective.
It's subjective.
And it's subjective by era and place. And the same thing with wrestling. That's why a lot of traditional, Southern wrestling fans from the 80s, their preference is the harder hitting, less comedic style.
Right.
California style wrestling is very flashy, very flamboyant, where the comedy stuff's allocated.
That's like you not liking Vince Russo and me really not liking Vince Russo. See, we have a different opinion. One stronger than the other one. But no, as far as The Undertaker, it's the man's opinion. The dude's been in the business long enough. Who are you to dictate his opinion of professional wrestling?
He's got good opinions. He's got bad opinions. You take the good, you take the bad, you take them both. There you have the facts of life. Facts of life.
My two dads.
Guys, check out that interview. It's good for wrestling that The Undertaker's out there talking. Joe Rogan has a huge sports influence.
It's not the first time, Joe Rogan.
Thank you for watching us. Let us know what you thought about the interview. Some of your takeaways down below in the comments. After you like and subscribe, find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ProWrestlingThrowdown. Email us at ProWrestlingThrowdown@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at ProWrestlingTD. And stay tuned because these next round of videos are going to be so much fun.